over 100 years ago, Thorndike described operant conditioning, and this process is one of the most reproducible findings in all of science. Eric Kandel got the Nobel Prize when he studied this in aplesia. In humans, we study this, again, using an example in addictions. So just going through this, we have a positive affective state that leads us to want more of it. So for example, if we eat a good meal, it feels good, we have a craving to smoke. We smoke, and this maintains that positive affect. This lays down this memory that reinforces positive affect and also increases the salience of other cues that are similar. Same thing goes, let's say you get yelled at by your boss, that doesn't feel so good, you want that to go away, so you smoke, you feel better, and this reinforces the smoking process in itself. Now we can do this so many times that it becomes automated, again to the point where we don't even notice this part, but we might notice a half-smoked cigarette in our mouth as we run out the door. Now this is interesting if you look at current treatments, for example, for addiction. There's a lot of emphasis on avoidance of cues, which can be very helpful, and also substitution strategies. So for example, with smoking, some people go and they teach themselves, or they eat carrot sticks every time they have a craving to smoke instead of smoking a cigarette. Well, this is all well and good until Easter comes around and there's a run on carrot sticks at the grocery store due to the Easter bunny or whatever, and then we don't have our cigarettes. And our brain says, well, this craving's here, you don't have your carrot sticks, what do you do? And it goes back to smoking. So the essential parts here are that these can be helpful, but they don't actually dismantle this core loop as shown in these black arrows. So is this the only place that positive and negative reinforcement have been described? Thorndike, back in 1898, published a paper. Well, it turns out, if you go back to the very, very early Buddhist literature, 2,500 years ago, this process was described. Now, it was described in slightly different terms. They'd called it dependent origination. But if you look at the core elements of it, these are basically the same thing. And what they described is that there's a trigger that comes into the brain, and it gets evaluated as pleasant or unpleasant. And this leads to a craving, and they describe as craving for the pleasant to continue and a craving or aversion for the unpleasant to go away. This leads to a behavior, and this is really where the language differs slightly, is that they describe the birth of a self-identity around this. And this memory gets laid down of me. And the more I do something, the more I see myself doing something in the future. So they describe this as the birth of a self. And they actually talk a lot about the self itself being the problem. So we did a randomized controlled trial. We compared mindfulness training for smoking. So we adapted our training specifically for smoking. We compared it to the American Lung Association's Freedom from Smoking. Some would argue this is the most disseminated gold standard treatment out there. You can find it in just about all 50 states. And we matched these for length of sessions. There were 8 in each. And each group even had training. Each group even had 5 sessions on a training CD that they took home. So we tried to match it for everything that we could. And our primary outcomes were 1 week point prevalence abstinence, which is one of the gold standards. You can biochemically verify this with carbon monoxide monitoring. And we looked at both at the end of treatment, which was 4 weeks, and a 4-month follow-up. So this was delivered twice weekly over 4 weeks. This is a busy slide just to show you the randomization scheme. It's not that important to note the details. We screened about 750 folks, randomized about 88, and had a pretty high completion rate as well as a pretty good follow-up rate. So we had about a 90% follow-up rate at the end of the 4-month, at our 4-month time point. So the short of the story is freedom from smoking works. It helps people quit smoking. Here's the number of cigarettes reported smoking per day. You can see that this drops significantly in the silver bars in the freedom from smoking group. We were pleasantly surprised to see that the mindfulness training did a little bit better even than the freedom from smoking. Now, gold standard is point prevalence abstinence. When you look at point prevalence abstinence, this is carbon monoxide verified. You see we saw about a 36% abstinence rate at the end of 4 weeks, about 15% in the freedom from smoking group. And these gains were largely maintained at the 4-month follow-up. So this was very, very encouraging for us. This wasn't compared directly to pharmacologic treatment, but is on par with these treatments. So what's going on? We can see some clinical efficacy, but it'd be really nice to see what's going on mechanistically. And this is, again, where we can turn back to the early teachings. The Buddhist teachings talk a lot about craving. Well, smokers talk a lot about craving too, so why don't we start there? It turns out that craving is a very good predictor of relapse. For example, for every additional point on the questionnaire on smoking urges, you have an increased risk of relapse is 10%. You get a 32% of folks that will relapse within 1 week of cessation if they have high scores versus fewer than 15% with low craving scores. In another study, folks found that for every 1 standard deviation increase in craving scores on the target quit date, the daily risk of relapse rose 43% on that day, and it rose to 65% on the next day. So craving and smoking are pretty highly correlated. So our hypothesis was that mindfulness training would work by decoupling craving and behavior. So if you think of a fire, and if craving's your fire and that fire's burning, every time you smoke, you're adding a log onto that fire, you're fueling it. So the idea would be, if we stop fueling that fire, the craving should go away, but it wouldn't necessarily go away right away. Your fire's not going to burn out suddenly without consuming all of its fuel. So what we found when we looked at the craving, the correlations between craving and cigarette use, that indeed there was a very strong correlation at the beginning of treatment that was completely gone by the end of treatment. Now, if you start adding variables into this equation, for example, the amount of times that people practiced mindfulness, we started to see a very interesting thing. So for example, every day of the week that people practiced formal meditation practices, they dropped 1 1/3 cigarettes. For every day that they practiced the informal practices, the rain, for example, that I showed you earlier, they dropped an entire cigarette. And you can even break this down by the minute of meditation and the number of times that they spent doing these informal practices. So this looks very encouraging. Your mom was right. Do your homework. The more you practice, the better you get at this. We took this one step farther to see if we could actually see if the amount of practice moderated this craving, this relationship between craving and smoking. For those of you that aren't that familiar with moderation, I'm not that either, but I'm just going to walk us all through it. A moderator is a variable that alters the direction or strength of the relation between a predictor and outcome. So for example, if you take the relationship between psychotherapy and depression and you ask, who's helped better, more or worse by psychotherapy, men or women, you can include that in the equation as a moderator variable. Same too for craving and smoking. If you say, well, does the amount of home practice actually affect this relationship, you can put all of these into your regression equations. So we did just that, and what we found was that baseline craving did not predict smoking, baseline cigarette use, even end of treatment craving didn't predict it, but this relationship again was predicted by the amount of informal practice, and this informal practice completely moderated the relationship between craving and smoking. And if you go back and look at the craving scores, remember that fire analogy, interestingly at the end of treatment, there was no difference in the mindfulness training group between those who quit smoking and those who ended up continuing to smoke. But if you look later on, the craving scores continue to drop in those that have quit and continue along for those that haven't quit. So again, suggesting that if you don't fuel this fire, it will eventually burn out. Bringing this back to our heuristic, theoretically, mindfulness might actually break this loop up, which is really good news for us. It might get at the heart of the problem.